Hello and welcome to Beyond the Page, a Life is Story podcast. I'm Josh Olds, and today I'm here with Stephen James, storyteller extraordinaire. Stephen's the best-selling author of the Bowers Files series, one of my favorite series of all time. He's also authored a number of books on writing, on the art of writing, story trump structure, is one of your books, but your latest one focuses on a different kind of storytelling within public speaking. You wrote it with Tom Morrisey. It's called The Art of the Tale. Engage your audience, elevate your organization, and share your message through storytelling. Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Glad to be here. I'm really excited about this book because it's something different than what you've done before. So just by way of introduction, what is this book's focus and how is it different than your previous books on storytelling?
Well, my previous books have really focused, for the most part, on writing, using story at the base of either fiction or nonfiction, even memoir. But this book really focuses on the art of telling a story orally. So it was fascinating to meet up with my friend, Tom Morrisey, as you mentioned. He's a world-renowned speechwriter. And so I thought with my background telling stories and his writing speeches, maybe we could put together a unique perspective on the art of storytelling. And so that was kind of the impetus for the art of the tale. And it's been fascinating because I've really rethought over the last 2 years as we worked on the book, what I think lies at the heart of all great stories. And it isn't what I thought. So it's been a fun and fascinating journey.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about how did you meet Tom? How did you guys come together and decide this is something that isn't being talked about enough, or it's something that the two of you in particular, your voices together, are going to make something unique and different that people can learn from?
I think we met at a writers conference and ran into each other again at a Writers Digest and film conference out in LA. And in any case, we got to know each other a little bit through some of these events, some of these different conferences, and just kind of became friends. And then as I was debating the idea of writing a book on the craft of telling stories, I was like, I wonder if he'd be interested. So as it turns out, he's currently working at Disney. So I went down a couple of years ago to Disney, and we spent the day wandering around the Disney parks, brainstorming ideas for the story. And so it actually kind of had its, I guess, genesis standing in the line for the roller coasters over there at Disney. Is kind of, I don't know if we outlined it, but at least we planned out who's going to do which chapters there in the Orlando sunlight.
Well, it's long line, so you got plenty of time to
I know, right?
Talk about what you're doing.
Yeah.
So take me through some of the lessons in the book. This starts off, what am I going to learn when I read this book?
I think that one of the things this book approaches a little bit differently and uniquely is the idea of what is a story. A story is not just a list of things that happen. It's not just a list of things that happen in 3 acts, first act, second act, third act, but we really unpack the 6 aspects of all great stories and sort of look at examples of stories from our lives, from speeches that Tom's given, and say, here are the places that these 6 aspects or 6 elements of the story appear, and how you can, when you tell a story, really think through how to approach it from the perspective of having all 6. And then if you do that, you can elevate the story that you're telling. Mm-hmm. So I can talk through them really quickly. Basically, the first few are not, I'll say them and you'll be like, well, of course, that seems super obvious. Like character. Yeah, a story needs a character. Of course, that seems super obvious. But then also a setting and time and place, geotemporal. So settings are not just a location, but it's a when and where. So you're like, okay, well, that seems reasonable too. Then a lot of people will say the next thing a story needs is a plot, which I don't necessarily agree with. I think the next thing a story needs is a struggle. Like you can have a list of things that happen, but without a struggle, you don't have a story. You just have a report maybe. And so you need a struggle to have a story. And the fourth is a pursuit where the character wants something, tries to get it, things get in the way. That's where the struggle comes from. So you can actually have a story that just has those four: character, setting, struggle, pursuit, but it won't necessarily be a great story. It can be predictable. You're like, oh, I think I know where this is going to go, and it goes there. So for a story really to be elevated, it needs what I call a pivot. Pivot is where there's a moment where things you expect them to go in one direction, but they don't. They change, they alter into a new direction. But when it happens, you're like, that totally makes sense. Some people might say it's a twist, but I really look at it as that as a pivot is every scene or every story would have. It's unexpected and inevitable both. And finally, payoff. Payoff is where if it's a funny story, we laugh. It's a heartwarming story. It really impacts us. So it's not just the same as a theme, but it's more like the overall impact of the story. So to have a great story, I really emphasize for people to find the pivot, locate that moment at which all seems lost or all, and then how does it pivot toward the ending that's unforgettable, in a way that's unexpected, we don't see, but when we see it, we appreciate it. That's kind of the secret to the framework of the stories that we talk about in the book. Then we talk about performance, techniques, how to write stories like a speechwriter, transformative ideas for shaping messages, telling stories, personal stories, but it's kind of rooted in this new idea of what makes a story work.
Mm-hmm. I think you said in the introduction that in writing this book, you kind of changed your idea of like what made a story. What were the changes that you personally made as you were working through these elements?
Well, honestly, I never really thought of the pivot and the payoff as being so vital to stories. I think a lot of natural storytellers and authors, screenwriters, and so on will include this pivot, but without it, you just have too predictable of a story. So when I was telling, stories, and when I was teaching about writing and storytelling over the years, I would emphasize things like struggle, discovery, things like escalation and tension, and all of these things. But I never really landed on the pivot until I started working on the art of the tale.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about oral storytelling. I'm seeing a lot. I'm a pastor, so I'm familiar with public speaking. I have seen a lot of public speakers, and I've seen really good public speakers, and I've seen some public speakers that not so good. And I have seen both use story. So using story doesn't just automatically make you good at uh, public speaking. There's ways in which story can be very awkwardly thrown into speech, ways that it can be very well integrated into the theme or the topic of whatever speaking. When we're talking about putting together a speech, which is generally you're given a topic and you're given a time frame, how do you source your stories, or how do you ensure the way in which you're telling the story seems natural to the context and to the topic that you're called to speak on?
Well, that's a good question. It brings up two thoughts in my mind. Number one is, what lies at the heart of a delivery of a story? So there are really four factors. One is the storyteller himself, his gifts, abilities, and so on, or herself. Second is the audience, their familiarity with the story, their preparation to hear it, and so on. So I think that storytellers should always prepare with the audience in mind. The third is the story itself. What's the mood? What's the pace? And all of those factors. And finally is what you just mentioned, the social context or the setting where it occurs. So those four things should have impact and affect the delivery of the story. And if you leave any one of them out, then you end up with a story that might fall flat. Now, the other part of the question has to do with like a full talk. How do you shape a full talk? And In the book, The Art of the Tell, I actually talk through what I call like the kung fu lesson or approach to public speaking. And so it has like a number of different things. Let's say you're giving a talk. Well, one of the things you want to do is grab them by the throat. Okay, so like get their attention early on. And the second thing is tickle them in the funny bone. Like, we love humor. It needs to be appropriate, not sarcastic. It cuts down people like that. But instead, we want to grab your attention, want to allow you to smile and laugh, have a moment of lightheartedness. We also want to touch you in the head by appealing to intellect. And then I was like, I know it's violent, but punch him in the gut with the truth. Like, tell the truth. Like, don't be afraid of telling the truth. I mean, truth's what we long for, we need, even though it's not always comfortable to hear. And so then touch them in the heart, with emotion, and let them show some backbone by applying the lesson in their lives. So if you can remember some of those things, it's like use surprise, use humor, you appeal to intellect, use emotion, appeal to will. And if you structure a talk around sort of this movement, usually you can create a good structure for that message. Now, there are lots of other ones we talk about in the book, different ways to do a message and stuff, but the last one that I feel like is pretty easy to remember is to just think about some kung fu lesson, and it'll help you remember those different aspects of the talk you might be giving.
Mm-hmm. When I was reading through the book, one of the things that I think, when I'm reading it in terms of, how can I improve in my public speaking, and then looking back at maybe my public speaking ability 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and seeing how have I improved since then. Like, did I, when I was looking at some things, I'm like, okay, I do that, I've implemented that, I follow that, and then thinking about, did I do those things in the past? How have I evolved as a storyteller, as a speaker, over time? And the thing that stood out to me that I do better now than when I first started, and that's probably true for a lot of people, is the interplay between the speakers and the listeners. Because if you've not done public speaking before, then you're not attuned to what speaking in front of a crowd is going to be like. Or you could have you have small audiences, and those are much different contexts than larger audiences, or audiences that you're familiar with, different than audiences that you aren't familiar with, or even just your setting. If your setting is different, then those things change. What are some ways when you're public speaking that you can be comfortable with the audience, to make yourself? Because I feel like if you whatever speech you're giving, whatever topic it is, whatever story you're telling, if you don't feel comfortable standing up in front of people, you're not going to do a great job, most likely, of communicating whatever it is that you're trying to communicate. So when it comes to that relationship between the person speaking and the audience, how do you make yourself comfortable and kind of develop that relationship that for this time period, I'm going to be standing up here and trying to communicate whatever this information is to you?
Well, I mean, a simple thing is to find out whatever you can about the audience beforehand, and then don't try to be funny or try to, like, there's nothing less funny than someone trying to be funny. So that's why I like to say, okay, get up, and you might use something surprising where people are like, I wonder where he's going with this. Never insult your audience. Never say, you guys are not very good listeners or anything like that. That'll undermine. Think about the social context. Basically some communication happens in more of a conversation like we're having. And some of it happens more in a performance, like if you went to go see a one-person play or something like that. So in a conversation, you don't always know what you're going to say or who's going to speak next or where things will exactly go. And if one person pauses in the middle of the conversation, the other guy's like, not usually thinking, he forgot his lines. But if you went to go see a show and they pause in the middle, you'd be like, oh, this guy forgot his lines. So we have different expectations of who should speak and when. And so understanding, what do people expect out of this presentation? Do they expect it to be a conversation, or do they expect it to be more on the performance end? And then finding out where you're most comfortable on that continuum and trying to align it with the expectations of the listeners. And then the last thing that just comes to mind is really just being receptive to the listeners and showing confidence. I mean, one of the most attractive things to us when a speaker gets on stage is just that they have poise. They're comfortable in their own skin. They're not pretending to be better than they are or impressive. They're just present. And we like that. We want that. We want confidence in the speakers that we have before us. And if they have poise and confidence, it'll usually draw us in. And if they have a warm sense of spontaneity and receptivity to the audience, very often that will really help to break the ice, even if it's an unfamiliar group.
Mm-hmm. There's a point in the book, I think this is in a chapter that Tom wrote, where he was talking about really ending your time strong, and talked about the problem with Q&A sessions being at the end of a speech is that it's sort of there's no great way of ending that on a strong note, usually, because of it being so unpredictable of where can that go. So you might be in a context where you want that interplay, you want that back and forth. How do you then still have that strong ending that you're hoping for?
Usually if I do a Q&A, I'll say beforehand, I'll take 10 minutes and we'll address your questions, and then I'd like to close up with a few closing comments, or let me just close up our time together with a little story or something like that, so that then after the Q&A I can then be the one in kind of control of how things will end. And some people in a Q&A, they want to hear themselves speak. Sometimes they'll ask questions that aren't appropriate or whatever it might be. And so what happens then is you're no longer in control of the conversation, of the story, or of the presentation. And so, yeah, I like to close with a little story of my own.
Mm-hmm. I remember one of the first sermons that I ever preached. I had just started at this church, and they had told me, aim for a 40-minute message, which was pretty long as far as things go, especially when you're just out of seminary. And so I prepared a 40-minute message, and I preached it in about 28 and a half minutes because knew everything. And so we get done, and the worship leader comes up and looks at the clock, and he was like, well, we still have some time left, so if anyone has any questions, I'm sure Josh would love to answer them for you. And I was like, so fortunately, or I don't know, I think it was fortunately that no one really did have a question in that moment, because I don't know that I would have been prepared for the answer. But that was one of those examples that's like, well, I didn't have control over that whatsoever. And maybe later on, especially as I kind of gain that rapport with the congregation, any questions you have, you can come talk to me after the service. You can email me, you can do whatever. But yeah, it's quite a first week of being integrated into the church was like, okay, well, that was different. Wasn't expecting that. What are some common mistakes that you see public speakers making, either just in general or in specific when they're trying to integrate a story into their speaking?
Well, one of the things we really emphasize in the book is not necessarily, you're not trying to memorize a story, but internalize it so that you really get to know the story, but that you're able to take different routes through it depending on how the context goes and how the setting is and how the audience responds and all of these things. So one thing that I've noticed is actually being underprepared, where you're not really ready to tell, or being not responsive enough so that you've prepared, like you've memorized it, which is fine, I guess, but then suddenly you'll get to a spot where you're like, I don't remember what I'm supposed to say next. And then it's like super awkward for everyone because you're standing there and they think, oh, he doesn't know what he's supposed to say. So one of the other common mistakes that people make is going too long. Really, most people don't complain if you're a few minutes short. That's fantastic. They're kind of like, oh, okay, that was nice. You got extra time. But if you go over your time, if you would have done your 40-minute talk in 50 minutes, then you would have heard from people. So, yeah, being prepared is super important. I like to tell people, write your stories with your mouth. Instead of writing them out on a page and trying to memorize that, write them aloud as you practice them. And you kind of, okay, well, I could use that in my story. Maybe make a little note here and there, but really write them and practice them aloud. Just by following a few of those steps, you can really elevate the stories that you're telling and the presentations that you're giving.
So what I'm hearing from you is that there is a manner in which you can come across as being too polished, too precise, and you end up lacking authenticity because of that.
Yeah, audiences really want to feel like you're talking specifically to them. Like, they don't love it if you get up there and you start going through your thing the same way, exactly word for word, that you've done, at 100 other conferences. Or they're like, well, literally, I'm sitting right here, just, talk to me. So we really do appreciate the personalized nature of presentations when they have that bit of spontaneity and so on. But we also do want people to be prepared. We want, okay, this guy put in his work and he prepared his story, his message, and so on. So yeah, if you just recite your lines, it usually will not feel as authentic and genuine as if you just kind of speak it more naturally from the heart.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of a speaker, itinerant evangelist. I won't say his name, but after some time, you listen to enough of his stuff at different places that he's spoken, and you listen to all of them, and eventually you realize, and part of it is because you speak so often, you have to repeat yourself. But there was a sense that, like, okay, I just, from the beats of his storytelling and of his public speaking, I could almost predict what story, what anecdote, what quote from, a certain author was going to come next in his speaking, simply because I had heard it so often. So obviously there are some ways in which we will recycle material, we will reuse material.
Yeah.
How do we find that balance between saying what is within our expertise and, like, what is the correct answer and what is going to make an impact, with also keeping the material fresh and making sure the audience isn't just rehearing something that they've heard time and time again?
I mean, one of the things we mentioned in the book is we say never tell the same story twice. And people say, what? Never, I can never tell the same story again. Well, what we mean is never exactly the same way every time you tell it. So that you're prepared, you have the story, but you're not trying to do it the same way you did it the previous event. So you really have that sense of spontaneity and receptivity to the story. So great storytellers tend to do that. They have preparation, they have receptivity, responsiveness, and spontaneity, and they kind of mix all these together when they tell their story, so that if the audience really likes something you said, they might kind of call back to that later on, and the audience is like, oh yeah, that we thought that was funny earlier, and he brought it back again. Or they might say, okay, wait, this isn't working, I'm gonna cut to the chase, and we're gonna move on to another event or another story or something like that. Mm-hmm. So a lot of that takes some practice, but the more prepared you are, and when you prepare, we always encourage you to prepare, in different ways. So when I was in high school, I had a basketball coach who always had this saying, practice makes, and most people would say perfect, but that's not what he said. He said, practice makes permanent. And so if you practice the story the exact same way every single time, that's how you'll probably remember it permanently. But if you can take a story and practice it a variety of different ways, maybe one time you go on a walk and you speak it aloud, and another time you just sit down and maybe tell it as if you were telling it to a little kid, or maybe stand up and tell it as if it were to a big audience. Each time through, you're sort of brainstorming what might work in that setting, and then you're collecting those ideas so that when you actually do tell it to the live audience, you're able to tap into each of those different aspects of the preparation that you put into it.
Near the end of the book, there's a quote that I wrote down. It says, "We believe the most effective speeches contain stories, and the least effective stories contain speeches." Can you elaborate on that for me?
Well, the way that we really think and process, remember things is really through stories. People who've studied memory kind of look at how do we remember things, why do we remember them, and all of this, and a lot of the things that we remember are in the construct of a story. And so we really feel like if you're trying to get just information out there, you could send a memo, that's fine, and people can read the memo or whatever. But if you want to build relationships, the best way is through telling a story as part of your presentation or your speech. And when we say the best stories don't contain speeches, we mean like stories contain a lot of, they all, come to us with a certain moral fabric. Okay. So, or in a certain moral universe. And if I'm telling a story and suddenly one character stops to give a speech or, a sermon, let's say, to another character, nothing wrong with sermons, but what we have is like, if I'm going to a presentation and someone gets on their soapbox and tells me that I'm supposed to think this way or do this thing, I tend to draw back and not be as apt to do that. And so one of the things we say in the book is to never tell someone what they already know in a way they already expect. So if you're telling something to someone that's it's new information, yeah, you could explain it, and sometimes a story works best for that, or an anecdote. But sometimes if it's something they already know, like I tell you an example of this one speaker talking about the importance of self-control. And he's up in front and there's 600 people here, and he's like, you should show self-control or whatever. Well, like, okay, like we get that. Like we know that, like you're having no impact. And so by telling people what they already know in a way they already expect, you're too predictable. So stories allow us to tell people things that they already know, but do it in a way they didn't expect. And at the end of the story, we can be like, wow, that was impactful. I can give you a quick example. So there was a man, this is an old teaching story from the Middle East. So there was a man who was really like, wished people would show him more attention and that they would bring him food and just pay him attention and like this. And so one day he goes in the jungle and he sees this fox with no legs. He's like, that's strange. I've never seen that before. And all of a sudden this tiger finishes his meal and drags over some meat and leaves it for the fox. And so the guy's like, that's strange. I wonder if that'll happen again. So the next day he goes out and he sees the fox with no legs. And then he sees the tiger finish it eating and brings the meat over and leaves it for the fox. So this guy's like, I think I know what I need to do. I think I know what this means. So he goes home and he waits for someone to bring him some food. He waits for someone to show up and show him some attention. Nobody comes. And finally, he's starving. He's on death's door. And he hears this voice. The voice of God speaks to him and says, don't you even understand? You were supposed to be the tiger. See, we might all know that we should show compassion to others. It's not all about us. And one of the best ways is to serve other people, to find meaning in our lives. And I could tell people that and they'd be like, okay, whatever. But if you tell them a story about be the tiger, all of a sudden it can have a deeper impact.
I am still here. I don't know what my video is doing.
So anyway, so when you tell a story like that, it has a character and a setting. It has the struggle, the pursuit, the pivot, and the payoff, all those things we talked about earlier. And it's not telling someone what they already know in a way they expect, but it's telling it to them in a way they didn't anticipate.
All right. Well, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I don't know what my video is doing, but we'll just wrap things up with the last question. And I want to move on to what you have coming next, because you have a book coming out, I think the beginning of next year or spring of next year, called Broker of Lies. I know it's still a ways out, but what can you tell me about that book?
Well, I am excited about Broker of Lies. It's my first new novel in a new series in a number of years. And so I'm working on the second book in the series right now, but it has to do with a gentleman who works for the government, and he is a redactor. So he basically knows all of the Department of Defense secrets, and he has to decide which ones he can and cannot release. And so from there, things just go crazy. He's got to stop a terrorist attack, and he ends up on the run, and all kinds of fascinating characters show up. So it becomes just a really fun ride, sort of an espionage story. And I had a ton of fun writing it. I'm looking forward to hearing what readers have to say once the Broker of Lies book comes out.
Yeah, well, I'm always excited for a Stephen James book. I'm thrilled to hear about it. So again, the book is The Art of the Tale, written by Stephen James, Tom Morrisey. If you are in public speaking in any form or fashion, this is a book that you want to pick up. Pastors, this is a book that's going to help you be a better preacher. If you speak in any corporate environment, just really, if you're ever talking to more than one person, or even if you're just only talking to one person at a time, this is a book that's going to help you communicate better. So, Stephen, thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. I really appreciate it, and I think it's going to help me in all of my future endeavors as well.
Thanks, Josh. I really appreciate the chance to be here, and best wishes to you and all of your listeners.